Hello and welcome in to another episode of the Fantasy Football Forecast. I'm your host, Trevor Scott, joined by my co-host, Matt Giraldi.
What's going on, guys?
And today we are going to be getting into 2024 league winners. So we're pretty excited to talk about these guys. We're going to do one each from each of the four major positions. And before we get into it, I did want to just say, if you're new here, please drop us a subscribe. This deep into the off season, we would really appreciate it. Still trying to grow the channel as much as we can. We also have 2025 way too early rankings. So that'll be posted in the description, links to a Google Sheet. And on that sheet, we also have rookie rankings. So if you're a dynasty player, you're looking for any dynasty content, we do have my current top 60 of the rookies, right? So that's 5 rounds. Most leagues do 4, some do 3 in dynasty, but wanted to make sure that there's a lot of guys, a lot of names that you can look into. There's a lot of good channels out there that do film breakdown on all these guys. So want to promote the rankings. Obviously, those things are going to change significantly, the rookies leading up to the NFL draft, and then obviously the 2025 rankings as we get closer and closer to the season. But it is fun just for me anyways, just to look through ranking sets, and it'll help us set the stage for our mock drafts that we're going to be doing. You already called me out for Bucky Irving and the one we just did earlier this week, so maybe I got to push him up a little bit, right? Got to start thinking about where we want to settle these guys. We'll get our projections together, and that'll help influence our rankings too as we're getting closer to the season. So without further ado, though, let's get into the 2024 league winners. So we have at quarterback, the first guy that we're going to talk about is Baker Mayfield. He was drafted on Fantasy Pros, ADP 21st amongst quarterbacks, and that was obviously a major mistake. So what do you got for us on Baker?
Yeah, man, he finished as the QB5, including 29, 23, and 34 point fantasy performances during the playoffs. And it didn't really come out of nowhere with Baker, right? Like, he finished QB10 last year. And, personally, I took too much stock in Dave Canales' like the QB whisperer, and I didn't draft enough of Baker, and I didn't give, Liam Cohen enough credit as the OC. And on top of that, I loved McMillan coming into this year, which really makes matters worse. And maybe I'm just salty because I took Stafford and Geno around in the same round ahead of Baker in our home league draft, where I went 0 QB. Side note, 0 QB can work in 10-team Superflex, but you absolutely need to hit on guys like Baker and Sam Darnold. But all in all, awesome season from Baker. And, if you watched our way too early mock draft, you saw him as our QB8 going into next year at this point.
Yeah, and so, Baker, obviously love him. He should have been higher, right? They re-signed him. They re-signed Evans. Godwin was coming back. The offense was better. Godwin was going into the slot. We should have been way higher on Godwin because of that news alone. And so, Baker just kind of got lost in the shuffle. I mean, we even had him at 21, even though we kind of pumped him up as one of those guys that we liked quite a bit. We did put him over Deshaun Watson, for example. And I know a lot of people were high on Watson, but, didn't have him over Stafford, didn't have him over, or I had him over Geno, but you didn't have him over Geno. So, it was just like one of those guys we should have been higher on. We should have been better about Baker. The guy I want to talk about at quarterback that was a league winner in Superflex leagues, obviously, is Jared Goff. And his Fantasy Pros ADP was 15. He was ranked 20th on ESPN, and I had him ranked 12th going into the year at quarterback. So I feel very good about the fact that I kind of planted my flag there on Goff. He was one of those typical quarterbacks that was like, look, he's not going to have the upside of Jaden Daniels. He's not going to have the upside of Caleb Williams, right? Those two young rookies that looked like they were going to have a ton of upside that were getting pushed way up. But in Superflex, the floor, the good offense, and just overall feeling good about having a quarterback that's going to be a solid starter all year long was why I pushed him up. And guys in that 10 to 15, 17 range, that's what I'm really looking for. And so I'm always going to push those guys up. And it worked out really well for me with Goff this year. I drafted him. Not only was he stable all year, but he was the ultimate league winner at quarterback. He had 41, 25, and 25 points in the 3 playoff weeks. I know there was some discussion before the season, too, that he was going to have to play outdoors at the end of the season. So the last 2 weeks were outdoors, but he still put up 25 and 25 after that. So I think personally that coincided a little bit with David Montgomery getting hurt, because David Montgomery did get hurt in that week 15 game pretty early. He only had 4 carries and 2 targets, 2 catches. So he only had 6 touches, which, if you follow David Montgomery, is not obviously the regular situation there. So I do think that helped him in the fantasy playoffs a little bit in a way that maybe otherwise wasn't going to happen without that injury. But overall, Goff finished his quarterback 6 on the year, and he is very good. I think he's going to get drafted really highly going into next year, would be my guess, top 10, especially in Superflex leagues where you're looking for the stability maybe over the upside at that point. When you're in the 5th round, I think Goff kind of settles in there in 10-team leagues.
Yeah, I mean, that whole narrative of like 14 of 17 games in a dome, but just watch out for week 16 and 17. Like all the best ball bros were like, oh, he's not going to work out. He's in Chicago. He's in San Francisco. Like, I'm going to focus my game stacks elsewhere. It's like, yeah, right. Goff was awesome once again.
Yeah, that's
just
work out. Yeah.
Back-to-back years. It was awesome. And I remember looking at the ESPN rankings like a week before the season and texting you. I was like, why even rank him? Like, if you're going to put him 20, just say, like, we hate this guy, and let's just move on.
Yeah, like that was one of the easiest calls we made. We did an ADP, like draft against ADP video, and like Goff was in that video as like, you need to draft him as in Superflex because he's ranked 20th. Nobody is going to follow that. And if you're in a league on ESPN where your league mates are going to follow that, then, you're getting an absolute steal there, and it worked out. So moving on to the running backs now. We do have 2 names that are very deep in the rankings. So obviously the guys up top that were league winners, Saquon, Derrick Henry, Devon Achane, like those guys, well, not necessarily Achane because he stunk in week 17. But, overall, when Tua was playing, he was like a top 5 running back consistently. In middle rounds, Kamara, Connor, right? We had a couple of those guys, and we'll talk about those guys in a later video. But the 2 guys we want to highlight here, first being Chuba Hubbard, who was 43rd amongst running backs in Fantasy Pros ADP going into the season.
Yeah, and finished as the RB12, including a 30-point week 16 performance. Unfortunately, he missed week 17, which killed me in the best ball finals. I was going into it thinking I was getting Kamara back and having Hubbard, and so I know he burned quite a few people there. We talked a lot about Chuba Hubbard for 0 RB drafters, but that was still under the assumption that like Brooks was going to be back in the week 4 to 6 range, and maybe we just underestimated Chuba like as a player a little bit. Like looking back at the year prior, averaged over 13 half PPR points per game in the last 7 games of 2023. And then bringing up Dave Canales again, we saw how he used Rachaad White as a workhorse, which led to White being the RB7, that year. And the lesson learned, I think, with Chuba is like, don't put too much stock in players coming off major knee injuries. We'll talk about lessons learned in a deeper video, but drafting guys that we know are going to be guaranteed starters to start the season like Chuba, like you got to push those guys up the board a little bit. But awesome for Chuba. He got the contract extension. Probably didn't need to draft Brooks if you're Carolina, but they're not always the best at drafting.
Yeah, and on Brooks, obviously, his ACL recovery ended up being significantly different than what the team was expecting. I mean, they said in training camp, possibly week 1, he could possibly avoid the PUP. And then it was, he's going to be put on PUP, but we expect him back when first eligible. And then it was like, we have no idea. And it was like, then it was just, you're holding on to this guy that, ended up playing in week 11. And I'm not even really that shocked that he got re-injured. Right. I mean, when somebody has that unpredictable of a return time, it was like, what's happening there? They're clearly not confident in the fact that he can play at 100%, and like literally 18 carries into his career, he tears it again. Like, that's very unfortunate, but Chuba is going to be very much more sought after in redraft this coming year because I expect Brooks to miss the full season in 2025. So Chuba, I mean, he's going to be a top 15 running back would be my guess. And I think I actually had him and Bucky Irving ranked back to back. And so I was getting a little bit of flack for you from that. But I don't know. I think Chuba as a workhorse going into the season where hopefully they'll have a little bit more stability, a little bit better offensive line and offensive weapons. I think that Carolina's offense from week 1 this time can really hit the ground running in a way that, you dropped Chuba Hubbard after the second week after they looked absolutely miserable for 2 weeks. So, I mean, even that early in the season, it was still like Chuba's going to have 2 or 3 more weeks of value maybe before Jonathan Brooks is back. And like, I don't know, I'm going to go try and add Bucky Irving off the waiver wire. I'm going to go try and add somebody that got dropped. There was a lot of waiver. Obviously, you want to try and be active early in the season to try and hit on some of these waiver wire guys. So, love Chuba. obviously he was awesome in that week. That 30-point week 16 performance likely puts you guys into your finals. The guy I want to talk about here next is Chase Brown. So he was 37th amongst running backs in Fantasy Pros ADP. And obviously it brings me joy that Chase Brown was really good. I was very much a proponent of Chase Brown over Zach Moss. That was not a question to me. I had Chase Brown ranked as my running back 24 going into the season. Obviously, as it turns out, it wasn't high enough, but that was significantly higher than consensus. And obviously putting out these videos, our league mates saw this, and my brother ended up picking Chase Brown as like running back 24, 22 or something, like really early. He picked him earlier than I was able to get him. So unfortunately, I didn't get in on him in that league this year. I did have him in multiple other leagues, though. He is another guy that hit the waiver wire early in the season in quite a few leagues, too, because Zach Moss was doing a lot of the work early, right? And I think that's going to be a part of our lessons learned video as well, is that when a team signs a veteran, but they have a talented guy that's there, like you got to draft the talented guy, understanding that he's going to take a little bit of time. So we'll talk about that more in depth then. But really loved Chase Brown. And then when Zach Moss got hurt is really when he took off. He took over all the passing game work and then was scoring touchdowns at a very high rate. Obviously, the Cincy offense was amazing and constantly chasing points. And he was out there 80+% of the snaps every single game. So Chase Brown, absolutely winner. I know he ended up getting hurt in week 17, but that was kind of at the end of the game. He should have just scored. Should have just walked in. But overall, he was a great player for everybody who had him this year, and definitely, being a top 10 running back makes you a league winner when you're drafted that low.
Yeah, it'll be interesting for next year too, because I think Cincy, the fact that it is a deep running back class, I would imagine they'll get someone in like the 4th-ish round range. Obviously, they've got a lot of holes to fill on defense, but I am going to be a little hesitant drafting Brown in like pre-draft best ball, for instance, just because you never know. But like you said, like I was team Moss over Brown, and I'll wear that L, and I was getting way too caught up in he's so good in pass pro and outside zone schemes and blah, 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 where usually I go to the more electric player, and we flip the script on that. And we
flip the script on this one,
and I regret it.
Yeah, and talking about the draft too, I think they are probably going to draft somebody as well. That would be my guess on how they're going to replace Zach Moss. I don't expect Chase Brown to get this level of workload, right? If we did, he would be a 2nd round pick, but I had him in the 4th round of the most recent mock. And if they do draft somebody, especially if they draft somebody more ready to play, like a Woody Marks, for example, late, Woody Marks is a little bit older, so like he might lose draft stock because of that. He's the USC running back. But he's extremely talented in all facets of the game. In pass protection, he's very developed, and he's a decent pass catcher. So if they draft somebody like that in round 4 or round 5, I could see him having an immediate impact here, and maybe drawing Chase Brown down a little bit. But most of the backfields in the NFL are split. So I think going into the season, we should at least expect that Chase Brown's going to have somebody else there as a running mate.
I just wish Woody Marks would wear gloves. Kind of annoys me when I watch it. Just not wearing gloves. I don't know.
Yeah,
I get the old.
He should wear gloves going into the NFL.
Yeah. Whatever.
Yeah. All right, going down to wide receivers now. We're going to get into 2 wide receivers here. The first one is slam dunk obvious, right? Jamar Chase. So he was drafted as wide receiver 5 on Fantasy Pros. So that's why I felt obligated to include him here, because he was far and away the most valuable fantasy asset this season. He was so much better than even wide receiver 2. And the gap between him and wide receiver 2 was like the same between 2 and 20 or whatever. So he was such an advantage to have. He had these massive blow-up weeks. If you had him, you made the playoffs for sure. He wasn't the greatest in the playoffs, but I know even in our league, the owner that had Chase made it to the finals. So it's just like he was such a awesome player all year long. And the reason his ADP slipped that far was because he was holding out. So I think we learned a lesson there too. And maybe we should stop talking about our lessons learned in this video so that you guys will watch the lessons learned video. But obviously when you have superstars holding out, not star players, when you have superstar players holding out, that's probably not as much of a big deal in terms of them getting caught back up to speed, especially when it's a Chase Burrow type of connection where they don't need the reps. They're good. So had to mention him in this video. Obviously, everybody agrees with that. The only one that was even close was Saquon Barkley through the second half of the year. Bijan Robinson maybe a little bit too, but those guys were being drafted accordingly. So seeing Chase, when you look at best ball and you see that there were Chase Barkley teams, it's like, okay, like that was so annoying. But, so
Chase Barkley Henry teams, the way it was being drafted, it was like, it didn't work out necessarily in the finals. You needed T. Higgins and Devontae Smith, but man, there were some big teams going into the playoffs.
Yeah, seriously, of just dominating the league all year. But anyways, so the second receiver, we're going to go deep into the ADP, was JSN. So he was drafted as wide receiver 42 on Fantasy Pros ADP. In hindsight, that was obviously ridiculous. I mean, we were drafting him there as a rookie. And it was way more obvious that he was going to take a step forward. Tyler Lockett, another year older. I know we were still hanging on to the Lockett thing, but going into his second year, we absolutely should have been more all over this. We were all in on Geno, and why were we all in on Geno? It's because JSN was going to take a step forward, but no, we didn't draft him that way. So anyways, what do you got on JSN?
Yeah, I mean, I was so in on him his rookie year that, personally, I felt a little bit, I don't know, burned. I don't want to say, but I've spent so much time on this channel talking about how the Chargers should have taken Jordan Addison, and I will die on that sword. But I remember watching the draft when the Seahawks were on the clock, and I was like, oh my God, they have DK, they have Lockett. Is JSN going to slip to the Chargers? Because they had the pick behind him, and they took JSN. And I remember being at my buddy's bachelor party a few months later, and there was a couple diehard Hawks fans, and I was like, you guys took JSN and Charbonnet, and those aren't key areas of need. And they were like, dude, we just took the best players available, and we are stoked. So, and that's what they did. And they're both fantastic players. But like you mentioned, finishing as the wide receiver 8. DK was off to that hot start. He missed weeks 8 and 9 with injury. They had a bye in week 10, and he never saw double-digit targets after that. Lockett was a ghost. I know JSN in week 17 went 3 for 32, which really hurts. But man, what a year from him. That was really cool to see, because I know people were really fading him a lot, not just in fantasy, but as a player, and as kind of a first round bust, or the first wide receiver off the board type. But yeah, man, he's going to shoot up draft boards next year.
They were using it as confirmation that wide receiver class was way down, and now we're seeing him as a top 10 receiver in fantasy. And I think if he backs it up even through the first month of next year with double-digit targets and he's awesome, that we're going to start hearing about him as a top 10 wide receiver in the league. And I think going into next year that he's going to be the number one, not DK Metcalf. Metcalf was not able to get going. He was starting to turn into a diva a little bit too. He was starting to whine a little bit about the fact that he wasn't the one anymore. And, that's sometimes a tough pill to swallow when you're as young as him. But I think JSN is the one there now. And honestly, like we said, second year players, we're going to have to make sure that we're taking a little bit better look at them, especially when their situation can be improving in a significant way. My guy that we're going to be talking about that in a significant way throughout the offseason is Rome Odunze, right? He was behind Keenan Allen, who's an aging veteran, just like Tyler Lockett was. Now, Lockett stayed, so I understand why JSN maybe was a little bit lower, and I do expect Keenan Allen to leave because he was only on a one-year deal. But, Rome Odunze, I think, is going to be ascending and possibly taking over DJ Moore as the number one target in the offense, especially if they get Ben Johnson. I think there's going to be a lot of momentum behind second-year Rome Odunze. And we got to remember, this draft class for pass catchers was historic, right? So some of these guys are obviously going to get pushed way up, but even guys like Marvin Harrison Jr., we're going to have to remember that he was a rookie, right? He's going to push 1,000 yards, and that's still really impressive, even though he was well behind Brian Thomas Jr., well behind Malik Neighbors, well behind Brock Bowers in terms of production. So, JSN is going to help us remember this going into next year, that, we can't have these guys that low. We have to be drafting these guys as starters, and some of these other guys that are aging veterans or older players that are more safe, those are the guys that we're going to have to push down. Even though we can start them early in the year, we want these upside players to show up in our top 30 rankings. Moving over to tight end now, we'll wrap up here quickly. The first guy that we're going to talk about here is Jonnu Smith. Didn't get the ADP off of Fantasy Pros. It was so low.
Yeah.
But, obviously he was on the waiver wire all the way until week 8. And then after that, it was unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, he finished as tight end 4, and I just want to personally apologize to Arthur Smith for last year screaming at the TV when he wouldn't involve Kyle Pitts and he was using Jonnu Smith. Like, maybe he was onto something there, and it was just kind of another testament to how bad the position was this year that he finished tight end 4. And we're going to do like a fab lessons learned and go through some of the best and worst calls, and obviously whatever you spent on Jonnu was worth it. But that really came out of nowhere, and I am not trusting him at all next year. The Miami offense was weird this year. Tua was hurt. A lot of moving parts. We'll see how that unfolds. But at least at this point, I think it was just kind of a flash in the pan.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we're going to disagree there. Tight end was so bad this year. I mean, the fact that he was tight end 4, I think highlights that. But
yeah,
also, I think we're going to have to evaluate that team in general as they're going into the year, because I think there's a pretty good chance that they trade Tyreek Hill, especially if they can get anything in round 1 or 2 for him. And Jonnu, in that case, would become the number 2 target, maybe the number 3, right? Waddle, HN, and him are kind of going to be the offense. So if that's the case, and there's no Reek, and they don't draft a high-end wide receiver, they don't bring in any like big-time replacement for him, maybe have Malik Washington kind of slide into the number 2 wide receiver spot, I could see another very productive year for Jonnu Smith. And the other problem, I mentioned this to you yesterday about tight end, there was only, in our 10-team league, there were only 4 tight ends that didn't get dropped throughout the year. 4. That was it.
Yeah.
And so, who's to say Jonnu can't be tight end 9?
Yeah, I'm with you if Tyreek gets traded, but there's also a chance that he's the clear-cut number 4 next year.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see on that, but there's also a chance that everything stays the same and he's right back to being the number 3 or 2. I mean, he out-targeted, had more receptions than Tyreek Hill after Tua returned in week 8 through the rest of the year.
Because Tua was literally afraid to throw more than 8 yards.
Yeah, we'll see. I understand. We'll see. But the offense definitely shifted to close range. So that's what I'm saying. Like, if that's going to be what we're expecting, like and again, Tua had a concussion. It's not like his arm hurt, and Tua's production was excellent when he was back. He was in the top 5 in almost every passing stat, even with this dink and dunk style. And so Jonnu Smith was a major part of that. And if their offense is going to roll out similarly, I don't know why they wouldn't move on from Reek and use this new system that they kind of
because defenses are
maybe it'll help them in cold weather games that they don't just constantly throw it down. Oh, they bring the coverage in, and Waddle's going to beat him over the top.
Tua can't throw it that far. Whatever.
Yes,
I just hate Tua.
Waddle is still a deep threat. Like, if you take
I know he's a deep threat. I just don't think that Tua
Waddle can definitely fill a number 1 wide receiver.
Oh, I agree with that.
We need to do an episode on Jonnu Smith. That would be good.
Okay.
So moving on now. We'll go to the next league winner. Obviously, Brock Bowers was like the obvious choice here, right? But we're not going to talk about him because we're going to talk about him in a later video. But the other one that was definitely a league winner was George Kittle. He was tight end 6 in ADP, and he finished locked and loaded into the top 3 tight ends every single week. He was, very good overall. Touchdowns were up this year as well. I think this one I don't want to take anything away from Kittle because we know he's a great player, but this had a lot more to do with the fact that McCaffrey never played. Like, losing that big of a weapon in your passing game. And then Ayuk wasn't fully up to speed. So they leaned on Kittle early in the year. And then Ayuk got hurt. And then they're still leaning on Kittle. And then McCaffrey never came back. So they're still leaning on Kittle. And it just turned into this thing where Debo was very unproductive all season
Yeah.
long, so they continued to turn to Kittle. So it was just like this thing where he was the number one option and the most consistent option in the offense all year long, and that's not something anybody expected. We talked about how he's probably going to be fourth because of how good the weapons around him are, and it basically all just disintegrated and turned into him being the featured part of the offense. So that's why that happened. That's why I'm going to struggle to rank him in the top 3 tight ends next year if everything is looking like they're going to be back, right? If Ayuk is looking like he's back, or he might start on PUP, but he'll be back in week 5. McCaffrey's back to start the year. Juwan Jennings is back. Raheem Pearsall's ready to go. It's going to be a lot of weapons that, again, I'm just going to be like, I don't know if I can go back to Kittle. So that's my take there.
Yeah, I agree with that in terms of it being like a perfect storm for him to be productive. But he also, I mean, he hasn't finished outside the top 5 at tight end since an injury-riddled 2020 season. And I think not so much us, but like when we look back at the industry putting Kincaid specifically over him, like that was a projection versus like a big-time great player on a great offense. So I know like we were very hesitant on Kincaid. We made a short kind of warning people not to draft Kincaid at his ADP. But yeah, man, Kittle's just awesome to watch. I don't know. I watched that wide receiver documentary like I'm sure most of you guys did too. And he's such a character, man. I love him.
Yeah, he's so good. And the other thing I like about what you said about Kincaid, the real warning we said is we just don't see tight ends jump from like tight end 12 in production to tight end 5 in production very often.
Yeah.
In Kincaid, we thought, special player, maybe the number 1 in the offense. That obviously didn't happen. And then he got hurt. And Dawson Knox is still there. So it's just like, that was a terrible call by the industry overall. Everybody thought that he was going to be this 130 target player when he had like 55 the week before. He had a 4-game stretch. Again, lesson learned, don't evaluate players on 4-game stretches, a la Tyler Higbee, especially tight ends. So anyways, Kittle, overall good player. We're definitely going to have him over Kincaid going into 2025. But I reserve the right to push him down into the 5-6 range again, just because I am a little bit worried, about the other weapons on the offense. So with that, thank you guys so much for watching. We look forward to talking to you guys in the next one. Drop a subscribe if you're still here. Check out those rankings down below if you want to be a sicko and check out 2025 way too early rankings. And we'll talk to you guys in the next one. Thank you.